Intel's Core i7 still carries a legendary name to be revered, but today, nearly 15 years later, just how well is the original one holding up? And has progress in the tech space really been that slow since it came out? Now, today's video was originally sparked by the sheer value of these Core i7 chips, as I snagged one for just 75p, and originally this was going to be a video on the cheapest way to get into the world of Core i7s, because they cost nothing. That, combined with the fact a full working motherboard bundle was available for under £5 on eBay, meant this whole setup we're using today also can cost you next to nothing. We even got a somewhat decent entry-level Asus board with it too. But that's besides the point. The reality is these chips are now 15 years old, and the history behind them is almost as important as the benchmarks and the value they possess, and you'll be seeing that later on. So while we get everything all set up, just what is the original Core i7, why is it a bit of an oddball processor compared to everything else afterwards, and what is the i7's story? See, the i7 came to exist back in the world of 2008, mainly on workstation platforms with the Core i7-900 series, and it was this strange middle child that would go on to take over the world by storm, and by the time Intel's legendary Sandy Bridge architecture arrived, well, you know, it was what you wanted. You only wanted an i7, but its early iterations, well, they were a strange middle ground between the early Core 2 series like the Core 2 Duo and Core 2 Quad and the subsequent architectures that came afterwards. It was released on the same 45nm node as Core 2 Quads, and it does act as a meeting point between the older generation and in many ways where we are today. The actual architectural history is very interesting and very complex, so trying to condense it down is quite difficult, but I'm going to try and do my best to summarise. The best way to think of the Core i7 in its original form like we have it today is more of a Core 2 Quad with modernizations, which I know for those of you that understand these chips is an awful way to explain it, but for those looking for a more in-depth description, there's plenty you can read about it. The best way to talk about it here though is it was more power efficient, it brought back hyperthreading, introduced turbo boosting that we still have today, and became the standard for performance till AMD's Ryzen, because you got 4 cores and 8 threads, and we can all remember just how long that stuck around. And it had a name that quickly went on to mean that you had the best in performance. And even today, the adverts and marketing, they're still seared into me. Not as much as the Pentium 4 marketing, because that was how many Pentiums do you have in your PC? That's what people used to actually say. But still, the i7, it made a name for itself. Reviews of the era were vastly positive, especially on the chip that we have today, which was one of the most familiar chips, I suppose you could call it, as it became a go-to OEM offering. Virtually any Dell, XPS or HP performance machine you bought offered the i7-860, purely because it was available at a very low cost to OEMs. The thing is, for the vast majority of users, this didn't always equate into the best value. Unless you were doing video editing or something along those lines, there was very little in the way of performance gains over even a Core 2 Duo. It was a world that saw 2 cores being hammered and the others did nothing unless you were doing specialist tasks. So in reality, despite these issues, the marketing carried the chip because for most people, the Core 2 Duo seemed ancient. You wanted an i7, and it didn't matter if you didn't have a use case for the i7, it was the i7. You wanted to have one, and I certainly know that I did. As things went on though with the release of Sandy Bridge, which saw spectacular increases in performance, the original i7 went a little bit forgotten, with a lot of people viewing it, as I said, a souped up Core 2 Quad. And things stayed that way until about 2014 to 2016-ish, where these were now very affordable to the masses, with used boards and OEM systems flooding the market for decent prices, a trend that is only continuing downwards today, and this era saw a little bit of a resurgence for budget PC builders, as out of the blue you could suddenly build a very capable system for not a huge deal of money. I seem to remember from that time that an i7 would set you back about £30, and a board would be about £35, maybe £40. And then all you had to do was grab some RAM and a graphics card and you were good to go. I'm sure plenty of people that watch this channel will have fond memories of channels like Greenham Gaming or Tech Yes City, with a lot of their videos on budget tech focusing, or at least featuring, the i7 on and off, as they showcased just how good value it could be. Which brings us to the world of today. See, this i7 and the 1156 socket aren't on their own as being completely worthless. Sandy Bridge, Ivy Bridge and the 1155 socket are also at their rock bottom. People building cheap systems will no doubt go for the newer one, where boards and processors are as common if not more than these are, but I don't doubt there is a certain subset of people out there who are looking to build a budget PC and going slightly older just to have the i7 name. Well, that might be something they want to do, because let's be honest, that i7 marketing that I've spoken about a few times already, it did work, didn't it? It really did. So just what are the specs of the original Core i7? Well, at least the one that actually hit most consumers. Well, this one here is the i7-860, one of the best-selling i7 chips of the era, and its specs are certainly something even today, 15 years later. Released near the end of 2009, it comes with 4 cores and 8 threads based on the Linfield architecture, packed with 8MB of L3 cache. Although clocks here are lower than what would come before it and after it, it did help that it introduced turbo boosting. So although your processor only runs at 2.8 GHz when you bought it, without any overclocking, it will boost up to nearly 3.5 GHz as long as it's cool enough. Other than that, these are worthless. I bought mine for 75p, and you can grab them for easily under £5 on eBay, CEX, even AliExpress. You just have to search it up and you will find one of these. They don't cost any money. With that all inside and set up though, I was originally going to be pairing this with an RTX 3050, just so we could try and see how some of the latest RTX stuff hammers the i7. But sadly that brings us to issue number 1, which is graphics card compatibility. See, the latest RTX cards I've found can be very funny with which boards they decide to work with once you go older than 1155. And unfortunately, it just wouldn't work here, even on a rather nice Asus motherboard. I've got old OEM boards that run with Pentium 4s and mysteriously support these RTX cards. Yet, a lot of other boards I've tried, even newer ones like this, you won't get any display out of them. It doesn't even begin to utilise the card. Fortunately, I have an R9285 lying around which is more than powerful enough, so we can actually do some real testing on the processor. I'm not too sure who to blame here, but generally, the fact these motherboards aren't supported seems a bit strange for newer graphics cards. And just how are things running over here on the i7? Well, from the get-go, things feel just as fast as the latest processor. I mean, there's no difference between this and the systems I usually use. I'm running the latest build of Windows 10 here, and we have no problems. It's dead smooth, the hyper-threading, the turbo boosting definitely helps make things feel snappier, if that's one way to put it, and it feels better than a Core 2 Quad, quite a lot snappier than a Core 2 Quad, which, although good, doesn't get that momentary burst of speed, like when you're unzipping files or updating things like Steam, where the turbo boosting does admittedly come in and help. And trust me, after that one-piece Celeron we tested, everything sort of seems a bit like a miracle. Although I have just come straight from using a Core 9 Ultra PC, so I couldn't notice any difference between a Core 9 Ultra and this 15-year-old i7. And that's just getting things ready, running some updates, getting some drivers. We had a few programs open and there wasn't a problem. But the part you've all been waiting for. Just how well is the original i7 holding up 15 years later? Surely things will have moved on. Well, you're probably going to be as surprised as I did. I did also whack 16GB more RAM into the system, and we are doing all benchmarks in either 720p or 768p, purely so that all the stress on the system comes down to how many frames can the processor itself churn out. So please get ready for something very interesting in the benchmarks. Starting things off, we have Red Dead Redemption 2, which was a nightmare to get set up given the constant amount of restarts we had to do every time we changed a setting. We ended up with the game running in DirectX 12 mode, which offered a sizable chunk more CPU utilization than Vulkan, with the game pretty much using all 4 cores and all 8 threads and running at 2.9 GHz. I did keep Task Manager open during this to monitor how things were going, as for some unknown reason MSI Afterburner felt like playing up today, saying we were seeing 13% utilization. We weren't. We were seeing over 100% utilization with the thing turbo boosting, and we saw pretty much bang on 60 FPS most of the time, only ever slightly beneath that when something was going on and you're moving through the world quickly. Not half bad for a processor from 15 years ago. Remember though that we are testing at a low resolution for exactly that reason, to see how many frames this thing can churn out. So with a decent graphics card, think maybe GTX 1080 or 1080 Ti, it doesn't seem too stupid to pair it with something like this, whack up the settings, and enjoy the game at a pretty smooth 60 FPS. BeamNG was a tricky one, as it just ran too well with the usual tests that I do. See, even in the most intensive of maps, when going along quickly, we were seeing well over 60 FPS no matter what happened. On less intensive maps, we were seeing well over 100 FPS, and the processor wasn't even having to do anything. There was no utilization. In the end, to try and actually put some load on the thing, I ended up using one of the most intensive maps in the game, with all the traffic enabled, and the police, and that finally got things going a little bit. Even in this nightmare scenario for the i7 though, we saw anywhere between 40 to 60 FPS most of the time, with the occasional drop down to the mid-20s when lots of AI processing stuff was going on. Usually I'm struggling for double-digit frame rates in this game with some of the components we test, and all of a sudden we're having to turn on everything just to make the processor struggle. And we're still getting over 60 FPS some of the time. It's ridiculous how well the i7 was coping here. Counter-Strike 2 was a bit of a struggle. It was by no means unplayable, not at all, and we saw an average of about 78 FPS through the benchmark, which after shaders had loaded in stayed rather consistent. During competitive games the frame rate was liable to be higher than this, as there's simply less going on. However, for the sake of our testing, things did seem okay, but the game could drop down to the mid-50s when the action was intense, and sometimes even the 40s when lots of smokes were going on, with the processor whirring away with the turbo clocks engaged. It wasn't unplayable at all, and it definitely ran okay. You know, I could play it like this, but it's probably not enough for the most competitive of players. But still, it ran fine, and I think that I've just sort of accepted that no matter what frame rate you achieve in this game, it does feel heavier than Counter-Strike Go and Counter-Strike Source. But who knows, I don't play this game competitively. Next up was GTA 5, as it is still one of the most popular games out there today, and in single player, even with Battleline now running, it is the same story as it was on launch, with the game running fine at between 70 to 80 FPS, occasionally dipping down to the mid-60s when lots was going on. And outside of that, you were fine, the game still runs alright. Even today, GTA 5's optimizations, they're still fantastic to be honest, and over on the i7, it's brilliant. However, the world of online proves to be a bit of a different story. When running the game in a small lobby with under 16 players, we do see a bit of a performance hit, with the game only now managing 50 to 60 FPS. Not that bad, and it does stay in that region most of the time, with only occasional drops down to the high 40s if lots of players were on screen and lots was going on. So you won't always be seeing a perfect 60 FPS, but generally the game is smooth enough that you're not really going to notice. Unless you go over 16 players, which is where the processor and the netcode for this game really break down. It is a bit ridiculous that I now have to do 3 different benchmarks for GTA 5, but that's just the way the game is. When the lobbies are getting full, you'll see anywhere between 28 to 35 FPS, which isn't by any means unplayable, but you are now talking about a 50% performance hit to the frame rate. And that happens the moment the lobbies get slightly above 16 players. The game just falls apart. The game was never made to handle more than 16 players, and the frame rate suffers because of that. I can't really blame that entirely on the i7, as the game does have that known issue with utilization and higher player count, so the good news is that GTA 5 is playable in all situations still, just if you want to hit 60 FPS, stick to smaller lobbies and single player, as those full lobbies, the i7 just can't manage it anymore. Mount and Blade Bannerlord can still prove extremely intensive on processors when lots of large-scale battles are going on, but here that wasn't an issue, with the processor being able to churn out 169 FPS on average, topping out at a whopping 200 FPS as the maximum. Not usually something I ever touch on with maximum frame rates, but that does seem like quite the feat when running what is a rather modern and rather intensive game. Even when turning things up more with larger battles, it still runs fine. Overall, it doesn't seem to matter what kind of simulation games you want to run. If you bought one of these 15 years ago and these are the types of games you enjoy, you still have very little reason to change. On the topic of simulation games, I did think about giving RimWorld a bit of a test, which isn't really an easy game to test, as it can often slow down at later points in the game even on the best of systems. The internal tick rate of the game can go down to a crawl, so the frame rate isn't really what matters, it's how speedy the game is. So it's one that you more have to describe than go off the figures on screen. You have a 4x mode which can be enabled through dev mode, and that could slow down things quite a lot. Generally though, the game's native 3x speed saw the game run perfectly fine. This game is heavily single core dependent, meaning that things here, well, they were only slightly better than that of a Core 2 Duo or Core 2 Quad. So for games like this, which are heavily single core bound, you are still going to struggle, but thankfully with turbo boosting keeping at least one core running at 3.5 GHz, it made things a little bit more consistent and made things load a little bit quicker. Bethesda's Fallout 4 is once again one of the most requested benchmarks that I always get, especially on processors, and it can still be a nightmare to run at times given that its optimizations are considered and have been proven to be downright awful. And given that the game wouldn't run in full screen properly, even here on a fresh Windows 10 install, it had a weird problem where it would lock to 30 FPS, and I couldn't resolve that even in the config file. But eventually we got things running in windowed mode, with the game running anywhere between 55 to 60 FPS and plenty of utilization left over, which meant that there weren't too many hitches or stutters, which is a great thing for this game. And this game is strange, as you can throw the latest Core i9s and RTX cards at it and get weird issues, you can throw the latest Ryzen stuff at it and get issues, and then mysteriously you can load it up here on the original i7, and yes, you've still got weird issues, it's a Bethesda game, but you do get a pretty flawless 60 FPS, and that was impressive to see. Brand new indie games though can be a struggle, but I don't think that was entirely down to the i7. It was seeing full utilization, but even in a low resolution with low settings, I think our Radeon was struggling quite a lot here, as even though this card claimed it had headroom left over, I just think the R9 was holding us back a little bit here, so take this benchmark with just a pinch of salt. On a side note, who would have thought it that new indie games can max out an old i7 and a rather beefy Tonga-based Radeon card? I wouldn't call it unplayable, hovering around the mid-40s for FPS a great deal of the time, which could occasionally dip even lower, but never turning into a slideshow. Just an interesting one, and this is one of the first things that we've seen actually struggle. As for the latest version of Minecraft, things were fairly solid, ranging from anywhere around 35 FPS when we just spawned into a world of complete chaos. I forgot I closed this save on a random fire that had started, so great stress test there, through to an average of 96 FPS and sort of around that mark most of the time during general gameplay. This was over a few minutes of going around the world and just playing the game, and we saw anywhere between 70 to 130 FPS once things had stabilised. This was with fancy settings enabled, and it wasn't too bad of an experience. I can imagine with a lot of the older versions and Optifine enabled, you'd be seeing well into the 300-400 FPS region you used to. But here with the latest release that is quite a bit more intensive, it wasn't a single problem for the i7 still. But finally, can it run Crysis? And well, I decided to test the original version here just to showcase to you how weird the i7 is and was, as you can see the same, if not worse performance in Crysis as you do in Red Dead Redemption 2. And why is that? Well, when the i7 came out, most games barely used 2 cores. The fact that the i7 has 6 more threads that were just doing nothing, well, it meant that a lot of games of the era were like this. They were very solid, but by all accounts, worse than that of a Core 2 Duo, in some cases even worse than a high-clocked Pentium dual-core. It's about time that the i7 has really come into its own, and it's strange because these things have gotten quicker. They've just gotten so immensely good over the years as things have utilised them, that for something 15 years old, you wouldn't guess that the performance was like this. In fact, in modern titles you will see better performance than some of those dual-core focused games. And the i7 has only gotten better and better, and it doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. I suppose that there really explains what I wanted to say better than words could have put it. When I went into this video, honestly, I expected very little, and I went into this with the view that a lot of people have. Most people now, when they talk about the original i7, unless it's Sandy Bridge, they just call it a glorified Core 2 quad. And I don't know what it proves more. Could it be that the Core i7 was just ludicrously well built for the future, or have we really not actually come that far? I mean, games do still have to target consoles running awful processors from the early 2010s, and this i7 can easily run rings around those, even with just half the core count. It's just those benchmarks really caught me off guard, as I spent nothing to get this hardware, went in expecting Core 2 quad performance, and we've ended up seeing really capable benchmarks from a system that you can pick up for nothing. The world of day-to-day computing is also not a problem. I know I touched on it briefly already, but I just sort of started using the system, browsing the internet, running YouTube, multiple tabs, downloading bits and pieces I needed for bits that are coming up in this video, and you can't get this system to slow down or hitch up at all. It's not even like this is running with any fancy M2 SSDs on PCIe lanes or anything like that. It is genuinely running off an old 60GB Intel SSD that is mostly falling apart. I couldn't even give the system a proper modern fancy graphics card today because I didn't have anything better on hand than the R9 285. And it still just shrugs it off and carries on. If you aren't doing fancy gaming, in fact, even if you are doing fancy gaming, you really aren't getting too much better than the hardware we had 15 years ago. And for those of you wondering about temperatures and power consumption, it hovered about 68 degrees under full load, even when running an intensive 3D Mark benchmark. And that's where it would top out, about 70 degrees. And that's not bad, with it generally being around sort of 96 watts under full load with the turbo clocks enabled. In comparison to today's chips and how power-hungry AMD's FX chips were not too long after this, well, things look surprisingly good for the i7. I don't doubt a modern mobile chip. In fact, I don't doubt the Core 9 Ultra that I'm, using on the PC that I'm talking into now. You could run rings around this. It's just, for those that are just using a computer, there's no difference between that and the old Core i7. Now that boring stuff for nerds like temperature and power consumption is out of the way, let's get back to the world of fun computing bits. See, 1156 might pose some surprisingly decent value in the world of budget computing. I mean, you get that nice i7 name tag to go alongside whatever it is you throw together, all with the smug satisfaction that you never had to spend much money to get there. Maybe one day we'll get to that point with the i9s, but that is a while away in the future. So for now, the i7 will have to do. However, on a possibly more interesting note, as you can probably tell by my voice, this is where the world of retro computing seemingly comes into things. These things have flown under the radar more than ever, and although LGA 775 is on the turn price-wise, here, well, things have never been cheaper. Out of the box, even this cheap Asus board has full IDE support, so you don't have to faff around with any emulation nonsense. You've got direct support for old hard drives, DVD drives, any random IDE accessories you want. You could even do hot swapping for the original Xbox. If you really wanted, it'll all work fine here. And I'd completely forgotten that some of these old boards, they let you boot from USB, but make the system think it's a floppy drive. Yep, that's right, you can do that on this old board. Up to half a gig, it will make the USB stick act like a floppy drive. So for installing older operating systems, it's near perfect. And that's the thing, these are almost the ultimate retro systems that are completely overkill and cost you nothing. Now, despite the fact that you can install Windows XP directly on these systems straight to an SSD with no issues or modifications, no faffing about with RAM support, sketchy chipsets, you get all the modern convenience and none of the hassle, I decided that a bit of a better test would be to use this system for the strange world of Windows Vista. As Windows Vista is gaining favour a little bit, I myself have been using it a lot more frequently, and when you can have an overkill Vista system, this is where these systems may be even more use than a modern budget bargain. See, I loaded up Windows Vista straight onto an SSD, and there were no surprises, issues, problems, things were lightning fast as you would expect them to be, and I just got a bit carried away, which just goes to show the strength of where these things lie, as within no time I'd gone out, grabbed an old Radeon HD card, whacked it in the system, loaded up some of the best Catalyst drivers available, and we had what could be considered an excellent retro PC, all set up and running with high resolutions, tons of enhancements available, and nothing was broken. Everything was supported, and it just worked. It was a relief to be doing this, because usually I'm testing an AGP system, and I spend about 7 hours messing around trying to get Windows to just work. But today, it just runs fine. At this point, I wasn't even trying to run benchmarks. I was just enjoying how well this i7 was powering through the world of retro games, paired with a cheap Radeon. This is the 25p graphics card for those of you that recognize it. And you can pick up these old Radeon 5000 cards for next to nothing. They are worthless. And I was just installing games to see how good they could look and how smooth they could run, with no bugs or weird quirks that you always end up running into on a modern PC. Everything from Unreal Gold, which looked phenomenal at high resolutions and frame rates that were well in excess of 300 FPS a lot of the time, through to things like Half-Life 2 in its original 2004 form, which took on a whole new lease of life running with these specs. I was just turning up settings in the drivers that I didn't even know existed, just to look at how good things could be. And some of these are 20-year-old titles running on a 15-year-old processor, and there are no signs that it's going to slow down or have problems. Even titles that can be a tad funny given their single-core dependence like Morrowind, well, they run fine on the i7 given that turbo boosting, and you get some monstrously high frame rates that remain stable. It really is a weird situation because it doesn't matter what you throw at it. If it's modern, if it's old, it just runs it fine. So there we have it, the original Core i7 tested 15 years later. And what else can I say other than the performance today is still holding its own and will likely continue to do so until those Jaguar-based consoles are dropped. And its retro performance is coming into a world of its own, not just in terms of raw power, but for overall support. I actually can't see a time where this becomes redundant, at least not soon. Usually I draw a hard cutoff on recommending processors and saying they're non-viable once we're seeing them struggle to get 30 FPS. When we started this channel, the Pentium 4 was just about eking out playable frames. And even then that was mostly on older titles and simpler ones. But that just isn't the case here, because it runs fine. There's no inkling of it slowing down. It's 15 years old. This is very literally the equivalent of me testing the Pentium 4 when we started this channel. Yet, it's fine. We've come so far, yet haven't moved at all, because the only thing limiting these processors really is graphics cards having sporadic support at best. If you go out and get a nice GTX card or an R9 Radeon, a bit more RAM and an SSD, you're fine. Imagine if you bought a Dell XPS back in the late 2000s. You literally just had to upgrade it, and you might as well still have a gaming computer. I hope you found this look back interesting. I know the voiceover's been a little bit rambly, I'm a little bit ill, and it sort of just took me into a world of its own with trying to explain this video, because the figures don't explain the experience as well as just trying to ramble over the top of it does a little bit sometimes. Thank you very much for watching, and good night. How do I get out of boat in Minecraft? I actually don't know what it is.